In December of 2010, I spent 2 weeks in East Africa with a good friend of mine named Lindsay Matouche. Prior to leaving for our journey, we made a deal. I would help her with the expensive overseas flight with my surplus of frequent flyer miles, and she would plan the entire trip, so all I had to do was refer to her packing list and show up at the airport. It was a great plan that we were both happy with, but because I wasn't involved with the details, when I arrived in Rwanda, I had very little knowledge about what to expect and what we were going to be doing. And when I say very little knowledge, that's being generous. I was clueless. But I was perfectly fine with that, and I looked forward to the adventure. One of the few things I did know going into the trip was that we'd be visiting orphans. I'm sure Lindsay told me a few more details, but they were in one ear and out the other. While I was completely open to the idea of visiting children, after I heard the word orphan, I was a little worried. I told Lindsay I didn't want to feel pressured to sponsor a kid or something like you see on the television commercials. For me, this trip was about personal growth and self-exploration, and while I fully knew I'd be helping people on the trip, it wasn't any kind of mission trip for me, and basically, I didn't want to feel any kind of awkward obligation once I was there. Lindsay understood and assured me that would not happen. Over the course of the 2 weeks we were in Africa, we ended up providing banquets for not one, but two groups of orphan children, and we were able to spend time with countless other kids everywhere we went. The narrated slideshow I'm about to show you is made up of photographs and video clips of children I had the privilege of encountering in Rwanda, Burundi, and Kenya. My hope is that while sharing my personal stories, you will also learn some of the stories of these incredible children and that your heart will open up to them even a fraction of what mine did. It's always difficult for me to put into words what kind of impact this trip had on my life, but hopefully some of the stories I'm about to tell you will give you a little insight as to what I experienced. Before I went on this powerful journey, when I thought of African children, I immediately conjured up stereotypical images portrayed on infomercials of sad faces of despair and flies on eyeballs. And while I did manage to capture an image of a fly on a child's head, what I found more often than not was that children in Africa were extremely happy. They had beautiful smiles, and they all wanted to shake our hands and tell us, "Hi, how are you?" and "I love you." A lot of them even wanted to dance for us. Now, as you're looking at these photos, you may think to yourself that the children don't look very happy at all. And here's where things start to get a bit tricky for me to explain. Yes, these children live in extreme poverty, and yes, they have incredibly difficult lives that we as Westerners simply cannot fathom. And yes, a lot of the faces you're about to see do look incredibly sad, and at times the images are even heartbreaking. But the reality of it is, most of the faces in these photos are just those of confusion. Many of the children we came across had never had any interactions with white people, or Mzungus as they called them, in their entire lives. So for me to be crouching in front of them, just inches away from their face with an enormous camera lens, it was just perplexing to them. So believe me when I say, once I put the camera down, smiled, and shook their hands or hugged them, they were smiling from ear to ear, and they were anxious to show Lindsay and me how big their hearts were. Our trip started in Kigali, Rwanda, at the home of a pastor named Alfred. By the end of the few days I spent with Alfred, I concluded that he is one of the best examples of a human I've ever come across in all my years of traveling. Alfred played a very important role on our trip, as he is the one who introduced us to many of the children we met. Between the 3 churches he pastors at, Alfred's community cares for somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 orphan children. These are children who have no mother and no father. Many of them died of diseases such as HIV and AIDS as a direct result of the horrific Rwandan genocide of 1993. Here in the U.S., when children don't have parents, the government steps in and places them into foster homes or orphanages. While the conditions are less than ideal, they still are provided with, in one way or another, the basic essentials of life: clean water, adequate food, proper shelter, clothing. They even have access to education. But for the children we met in Rwanda, there is no such thing as an orphanage, and no one provides these children with the basic necessities of life. For these children, nothing is a guarantee. Alfred went to the congregation in his 3 churches and asked everyone to take in children from their community until all of them had a place they could call home. However, most of these people live in extreme poverty and could not commit to providing food and clothing for the children. Upon the realization of this response, Alfred went back to his congregations and asked that even if they couldn't provide food and clothing, they at least provide a safe place for the children to sleep at night to get them off the streets. Together, the people of these 3 churches agreed and took in the children until each of them had a roof over their head. All 800 of them. What this means is that when the sun rises and the children wake up, they leave the house, and they pretty much stay gone until the sun goes down and they're ready to go back to sleep. During the day, they are on their own. They fend for themselves and scrap or beg for food. In most cases, the roof over their head while they sleep is the only thing provided to them by their foster families. Even though I knew that this was the case with these kids, the reality of it didn't really hit me until I came across this little boy. He was just sitting there in the dirt, playing with a rock, filthy as all get out and wearing a Grateful Dead t-shirt. When I saw this kid, who couldn't have been more than 2 years old, it broke my heart to know that there was no one there for him. No one to care for him during the day, no one to feed him, no one to pick him up and hold him, and no parents to tell him that they loved him. I was starting to see why it was such a big deal for this community that Lindsay and I were there. The mere fact that we were there and willing to love their children and hear their stories meant more to them than I'll ever be able to comprehend. We weren't immersed in the culture quite long enough to really figure out the dynamics of the children's situation, but it was obvious that some of the older children helped take care of the younger ones, and it was also clear that it varied from home to home as far as how much involvement the foster parents had with the children. However, we fully did get a sense that each child is loved very much by everyone in the community, and that was a beautiful thing to witness. It was really eye-opening to see how much these people were willing to give, even though they had so little to begin with. Thanks to funding given to us by Lindsay's church in St. Louis, one of the things we got to do while in Rwanda was provide a banquet of sorts for the children at two of Alfred's church communities. The women of the churches worked all day to prepare staple foods for the children: cabbage, rice, beans, and a rare commodity for them, a few bits of meat. It was during these banquets that I really got to see a lot of the children and how they interacted with each other. It was fascinating from the moment I arrived at the first church. After watching some of the older kids help wash everyone's hands, roughly 200 children sat down on wooden benches inside the church. None of them were arguing, none of them were picking on each other. None of them seemed impatient, even though they were watching on for upwards of a half an hour while the woman dished up plates of food and passed them out. I couldn't believe how well behaved they were. By Western standards, the meal was anything but luxurious, but I knew it was an enormous blessing for these children, and that was truly humbling. While I was on the floor with the children, scooping heaps of rice and beans into my mouth with my fingers, I kept thinking how incredible it was that the meal we were eating was probably the best meal these kids would have all week, maybe even all month. However, I later found out that Alfred said the meal wasn't only the best meal they would have all week, and it wasn't only the best meal they'd have all month. For many of these kids, that day they got to eat such a fulfilling meal was literally the single best day of their lives. In addition to getting to eat with the children at the banquet, just by being there, I got a first-hand glimpse of their daily life and learned a lot about the African culture. It was often difficult to differentiate between the girls and the boys because the girls rarely have hair. As a Westerner, it seems a bit odd for a female to shave her head, but as a Westerner, it's also difficult to comprehend the thought of walking for miles on end with a bucket of water on your head just to have the resources to clean yourself. Once we realized how difficult it is for people in these communities to get adequate clean water for drinking and personal hygiene, seeing girls with no hair made perfect sense. Another thing I took note of while spending time with the kids was that some of them weren't wearing shoes. Again, as a Westerner, it was difficult for this one to sink in with me. These children weren't barefoot by choice. They absolutely wanted to have even the simplest pair of rubber shoes. But the fact of the matter is, if they weren't wearing shoes, it was because they didn't own them. Seeing the cuts on their small feet was incredibly sad and made me realize how much we tend to take things for granted. A few days into the trip, we visited the second of Alfred's 3 churches to give another group of children a banquet, and by this time I was getting over the initial culture shock and I was really starting to soak in a lot of things. At this church, before the children got to eat their feast, they sang for us. And unlike in the U.S., where children are often shy or embarrassed to get up in front of a group of their peers, in this church it was clear that there was no fear of being ridiculed. The kids were very eager to get up in front of everyone and lead the song, and once again, even dance. By the time we left Rwanda, I had concluded a few things. The children in East Africa loved posing for the camera, and even more than that, they loved seeing the pictures of themselves afterwards. Showing them the photos we took of them became one of the most fun things to do with the kids and was a great way to show them we weren't threatening. Another thing we concluded about the kids in East Africa is they loved following us around. No matter where we went, whether it was a market, a church, or a refugee camp, or even just a random village on the side of the road, the children wanted to go with us. They followed us everywhere while holding our hands, sometimes with several children on each side. After leaving Rwanda, we went to a small neighboring country called Burundi to visit a refugee camp. The people in the camp are members of the Banyamulenge tribe, a tribe who has been the target of racial attacks and genocide in their home country of Congo for more than a decade now. If these people tried to go back to their homes they fled, they would risk being killed. Once inside the camp, we were greeted by a literal mob of children that were so excited to see us they nearly knocked us down. This was the first time we encountered kids who wanted to touch our skin to see if it was like theirs, and touch our hair to see how it was different from theirs. It got so out of control that some kids were on the verge of getting trampled by the others. and some of the older men in the community had to start swatting away kids with sticks. Others climbed trees just to get a glimpse of us over the top of the crowd. Then out of nowhere, the kids broke into a song. It was a completely surreal moment. At the refugee camp, we were able to go into people's homes and hear stories about what life is like inside the camp for the children. They eat on average about 2 meals per week while living inside homes made entirely out of mud. The photo you see here is the wall of a home, which is identical to the floors inside and outside. Also at the camp, just like everywhere else we went, there were a few special kids that, for some reason or another, just stood out to us, and we ended up referring to them as our favorites. I found my favorite little dude had the most loving eyes and the biggest smile, and Lindsay found her favorite little girl too. We didn't stay at the refugee camp very long, only a few hours on 2 separate days, but leaving was particularly difficult because we knew that as soon as we left, the children would have to slip back into their insanely difficult and uncomfortable realities that is life in a refugee camp. We gave a few kids what little water we had in clean bottles, and they bolted off into the distance with them, guarding our trash as a precious and rare commodity because to them, those bottles and a few sips of clean water were a godsend. And as we drove out of the camp, the children ran alongside the cars until they couldn't run anymore. From Rwanda and Burundi, we took a 25-hour bus ride into Kenya, where we got to see a totally new culture and visit one of the most notorious slums on the planet, known as Kibera, where upwards of 1 million people live in some of the worst conditions imaginable. To an outsider, the miles upon miles of rubble may appear to be a landfill, but to a huge percentage of Kenya's capital city of Nairobi, these slums and the haphazardly constructed shacks built on top of layers of mud and garbage is home. It was gut-wrenching at times to see the faces of children who lived like this, but at other times it was uplifting to see their faces of hope. But still, in the midst of all the heavy and emotional sights we were constantly taking in, there was plenty of instances where we found joy and happiness in children who were just being kids, playing with their friends and making the best of the situation they were born into. There's never a conclusive, tidy way to wrap up a package like this. I could go the thankful route and talk about how, as someone who has traveled the world, this emotional journey reminded me how fortunate I am to have this life. Or I could throw in a few cliché National Geographic-esque images of women with their children and talk about how different the Western way of life is from the African culture. But when it comes down to it, all I really want is to end this with a smile. A smile for remembering the African children's impromptu dances, and a smile knowing how much it meant to these children that Lindsay and I took time out of our lives to visit them. And a smile for how much of an impact these children and this journey through East Africa had on my life. I'll leave you with the quote that I came up with as the best way to sum up my experiences in a single sentence. My mind and my heart have changed and grown in ways I may never be able to understand, and they will never be the same.